I'd known the story of Joe Boyle from the time I was a small boy. And I also had a friend, Len Taylor, who grew up with the same knowledge of Joe Boyle, who was an unsung Canadian hero from our small town of Woodstock. And Len Taylor was a reporter with the newspaper in his earlier days. And then he decided to do some research on the early days, early life of Joe Boyle. And it eventually ended as a book called The Sourdough and the Queen. Mm-hmm. But in order to complete that book, he had to do a considerable amount of research, and the natural person to contact was Joe Boyle's daughter, who was still living in Long Island, New York, Patchogue, New York, and he went to see her and got a considerable amount of information from Joe Boyle's daughter, Flora Boyle Frisch. And after his contact with Flora, she then wrote to Len Taylor and then also to myself. At that time, I was the president of the local historical society, and wondered if Woodstock could do something to recognize Joe Boyle and obtain for him the credit that he deserved as a Canadian hero. Well, many people knew about Joe Boyle, but they'd never recognized him for the work that he had done in Romania, mm-hmm. Nor had recognized him for his contact with the royal family of Romania and with Queen Marie. Mm-hmm. So when Flora asked if we could do something about it, I had a friend in Ottawa with the historic section of the Department of National Defense. I wrote to him and asked if it would be a worthwhile project to see if we could do something to recognize Boyle in Canada. Mm-hmm. Well, it just grew. And my friend in Ottawa, who is a senior historian at the ministry, said, well, first you'll have to obtain permission from the mayor of the city and your local member of parliament, and then we'll see what can be done in Ottawa. So and Flora was very pleased with that, because she said I would be prepared to come to Woodstock to do anything that she could to help. So Len Taylor lived in Vancouver, and he suggested that we form a committee in Woodstock, and I turned out to be the chairman of that committee, and we fortunately got some quite prominent business people to be members of our committee.
And sponsor it, probably.
Yes.
Right.
And Flora then said she would come to Woodstock to help us in our fundraising. But first we had to get permission from the government, and we wrote to the Minister of the Veterans Affairs to see what they could do. And I think he was quite aware that Joe Boyle was a Canadian hero, an unsung Canadian hero, and he was willing to help. But I think he had a few misgivings about whether we could carry out the project. But his letter said that if we could carry out all the logistics with the people in England and make the arrangements for him to be transported here, the Canadian Air Command would carry out the transportation. So we thought that would be maybe the end of it, but or maybe they thought that would be the end of it. But we decided that with our committee made up of prominent people in Woodstock, we had enough influence to obtain sufficient fundraising here to get it started. And our local historical society, when the idea was presented to them, although they didn't have many funds, they said, we will provide $500 for your initial research. And from that time on, the committee became very active, and when we had permission from the Minister of Veterans Affairs that they would provide transportation, we thought, well, we can handle the rest. That was his grave, and when Mr. Taylor saw it, it was badly overrun with weeds. And he showed that picture to Flora, and Flora said we should do something about it, and that's what we did.
And now it looks totally different. It looks exactly like in this
That's right.
picture, right?
Yeah, that monument was erected by the County of Oxford in 1867, I think, after the Fenian raids, when some of the Americans tried to cross the border after the Fenian troubles in Ireland. They thought they were going to punish the British, and they tried to enter Canada, but the Canadian militia defeated them, and one Woodstock man was killed in that. So the county erected that big monument for him, and it stood there, and with only one man at the grave for, well, from 1869 until 1983. Then we placed Joe Boyle.
The original?
That is the original urn that Queen Marie placed on the grave. She also had this ledger stone, which this is only part of it. This is the top part of it. Is Colonel Joe Boyle, CBE, that's Commander of the British Empire, DSO, Distinguished Service Order. And then at the bottom, this inscription is, "Man with the height of a Viking and the simple faith of a child," which is one of the lines from the Robert Service poem that Robert Service was wrote a number of poems about the Yukon, and he felt that Joe Boyle, and he wrote a book that used Boyle as the model. I think the book was Call of the Wild by Jack London.
Oh.
And that story was based on an actual feat and some of the things that Joe Boyle did. A lot of people thought that we were doing a lot of work, and we weren't going to be successful. But when we had the Canadian government's assistance, and we had the permission from the Canadian government to go to England, not only to see Joe Boyle's grave, but to meet with the officials over there, the heads of the church. They were quite surprised when we were able to carry it out, and also with the help from the Canadian government, when Joe Boyle's remains were brought by a Canadian aircraft plane. They supplied a company of Canadian Army people at the Canadian Air Force Base at Trenton, Ontario, and this was when the big plane brought Joe Boyle in.
And it's very suggestive, a body of a forgotten hero arrives and is covered with Canadian flag.
Then later, when we had the ceremony bringing him for the burial in Woodstock, the RCMP provided the pallbearers and the local London branch of the Royal Canadian Regiment, the company of the Royal Canadian Regiment, whose permanent base was in London. They came down with their all in uniform and had a parade along the main street to the cemetery, and then the official burial ceremony was carried out there. And this is the program of events, and this is the list of all of the honored guests, right from the Lieutenant Governor of Ontario and various important personages through 2 or 3 generals and colonels and members of Parliament. So they all came for the special ceremony that we had on that day. We appreciate the Romanian people Romanian Canadians coming from Toronto and other places to visit the Joe Boyle grave, and we look forward to you coming every year.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank you. Bye-bye.